are moving on to our next section after the different type of markets, imperfect markets, and then also creative destruction, and that is market failures, when markets are not able to internalize certain costs or certain issues that kind of skew what a market should look like, right? So what we've seen so far is that when we have correct market prices, right? When we have market prices, especially in perfectly competitive markets, right? They do a really important thing, right? And they distribute goods properly to those who want it the most, right? So basically, the people who need it the most, or the people who want to sell it the most, right, will benefit from this market price, which means that it's a efficient distribution of goods, which is very important for a market, right? And so, having market prices that are set, especially again in perfectly competitive markets, creates very socially desirable outcomes, right? It's not just perfectly competitive markets, but certainly they are the most the most responsible for creating socially desirable outcomes, right? And even in monopolies and oligopolies, are imperfect markets, right? We will still see the incentive to create socially desirable outcomes, right? So in the case of monopolies, right, what we saw is that what a monopoly would like to do is perfectly price discriminate, right? Now, is that desirable for consumers? Well, it is, because people are getting the good they want at the price that they're okay with, right? And so even though it might seem like price discrimination is much more beneficial for producers, and it is in terms of like the amount of welfare, amount of surplus they get, people are still able to get goods that they want, even if they couldn't necessarily buy it at the first price, right? And then in oligopolies, right, when we see cartels attempt to act as a monopoly, right, we tend to see the natural order of oligopolies break down those cartels quite easily, usually, right? So markets on the whole create really important things, really important social outcomes, really efficient social outcomes that help an economy run properly, right? And so this is really good, right? However, we see sometimes markets can fail to produce socially desirable outcomes, and that is when we have what are called market failures, right? And that's kind of the definition of a market failure, right? Is when we have the failure to produce socially desirable outcomes. Okay. And so there are two major types of market failures, right? The first one is externalities, which we're going to go into quite a lot of detail here today on, hopefully. And then the second one is going to be what happens when private property breaks down, when the concept of private property no longer works. And we're going to cover that tomorrow, or in the next video, I should say. That might not necessarily be tomorrow for you. It will be tomorrow for me, though. All right. And what happens when we can't establish property rights over something, right? We call those public goods. And again, we'll get into the 4 types of goods in the next video. I'm not gonna have that one in this one, right? So this is one of the most important roles of a government, right? One of the most important roles for a government is to determine what to do in the face of these market failures, right? How do they correct for them? How do they try to minimize them, right? Those kind of things can really impact how good a government is at dealing with market failures. Okay, so what we see here with externalities, right? Externalities are I think fairly easy to understand, we have two types of externalities. We have positive externalities, and we have negative externalities. So let's start with positive externalities first, right? So what is a positive externality, right? So first off, an externality itself is something that happens when the actions of a person or a firm, actions of one actor, let's say, affects the well-being of another actor. Right, actions of one actor affects the well-beings of another actor, right? And so when we have positive externalities, right, what we see is positive effects, positive effects of one actor on another. So, you know, something that they're doing accidentally, right, without purposely doing it, is helping another person, right, or another firm or whatever, right? And then we have negative externalities, which is much, much worse, right? Negative externalities are a serious issue. Positive externalities are more of like a nice benefit, right? When we have negative effects of one actor on another, right, without doing anything or without it being within the market, right? Okay. So what's going on here? What are some examples, right? So I'm going to use examples from the book, from the resource, because I think those are pretty good examples that they have. So one of the one example for positive externalities is a beekeeper living next to an apple orchard, right? Where the beekeeper, because the bees need to pollinate, they will go pollinate the apple orchard, right? The apple trees in the orchard, and so the apple orchard will make more apples because of the bees, but they're not interacting, they're not exchanging anything, right? Simply, it is just a positive externality of the bees upon the apple orchard, right? A negative externality, these are pretty obvious, right? One, the most obvious is pollution, right? You know, when a company pollutes, it causes health issues for the entire community around it, right? Or it can cause issues. Okay. So those are kind of some examples, right? And so let's take a look at what a graph would look like if these positive and social or positive and negative externalities were actually included in a market. Now, usually we're going to see externalities. Okay, thank you. We're usually going to see externalities come from the supplier side. So we're going to use that as the example, right? So we have our demand. Oops, excuse me. Oops, excuse me. We have our demand and we have our supply. Okay. So what we're going to see, always label. So let's say we have a positive externality, right? So if we have a positive externality occurring, right? Let's say that you know, the positive externality is actually producing $15 more benefit to the society, you know, than it is, right? So because it's producing $15 more benefit for the rest of society, right? What we should actually see then is that essentially the revenue of the suppliers is going to increase, right? So we actually should see this supply curve push out, right? We should see more of this type of good, right? When we have a positive externality, right? Because it is producing so much benefit for everybody else, right? It's almost creating this secret amount of surplus, right? That needs to get captured by the market. It's essentially taking $15 off the cost of the supply, right? Which means input costs are lower, right? This one's a little harder to understand, in my opinion, the kind of idea of a positive externality and how it affects a graph. But I think understanding how a negative externality that works is much easier, right? So let's say there's a $15 cost on that society at large, right? And then of a negative externality. And so what we should do then is we should take supply, right? And we should say, okay, this is actually now part of the input costs of the firm or the firms that are doing it, right? So when input costs go up, right, we should see supply decrease, right? So we should actually see significantly less of this good, right? We should see a lower quantity and a higher price of this good, right? To restrict them from producing as much and from people buying as much, because it is a negative externality, right? So when it comes to things like pollution, right, what we should see then is that the firms that are producing pollution should actually be producing significantly less of a good, because that pollution is a cost upon their community. Okay. So hopefully that makes you understand it a little bit better, right? Maybe more of what it is, and when it's a positive effect, it's actually an increase in demand. So that might be easier to understand, right? If it's a positive effect, people are going to want more of it, right? I don't know if that's necessarily one for one true, right? But I think that's kind of a general idea, right? But that's not necessarily true. I'm not gonna guarantee you that's what it should be. So I'm not gonna keep that there, right? Okay. So, in other words, though, when we have a positive externality, right, we usually have too little of the good, and we want more, right? We want more right now, right? Whereas if we have a negative externality, we have too much of the good, and we would like to have less. Okay, that's the general idea, right? Okay, so that is externalities, right? And so, how can we solve this problem of externalities, right? Um, well, how can the beekeeper in apple orchard benefit from this situation, right? Because the beekeeper, right, is just going about their business, but their business is directly benefiting the apple orchard, right? And so maybe it's more socially better for the beekeeper to also maybe get some more revenue, maybe even expand their to use that revenue to expand their beekeeping properties, which will expand the apple orchard properties, right? So maybe the beekeeper and apple orchard owner should negotiate, right, to split the gained revenue from these bees being right next to it, right? Likewise, if a community is being polluted, right, it might benefit the community to negotiate with the polluters, right, to produce less pollutants or find other options for them to prevent the pollutants from entering the river or the air. And so that would leave both parties better off, right? Right. It might not necessarily leave the paper company better off, but it would certainly leave the community better off, right? So what we could also do then is kind of combine these firms as well, right? Right. Maybe these two firms, the beekeeper and the apple orchard, could combine, right, to become one company, so that they could get all the benefits from these two industries together. Okay. So this idea, though, if we go back to this idea of negotiating, right, that is a fundamental kind of idea of externalities, and that idea was created by Ronald Coase, and is called the Coase Theorem. Okay, and the Coase Theorem basically says that if any two parties with externalities, if any two parties can negotiate, right, then they should be able to internalize the externalities. Then they should be able to, or remove the inefficiencies of the externalities. To remove the inefficiencies, to use the language of the resource, right? Basically, if any two actors who, and one of them is producing externalities, then they should be able to, externalities upon the other specifically, right? Then they should be able to negotiate, right, to find some sort of situation, right? One of the ones they talk about is kind of the yard care, right? One neighbor doesn't take care of their yard, and the other neighbor doesn't like it, right? And so they can come up with some sort of agreement between them about either they don't keep up their yard, and maybe it's worth a certain amount for the person who doesn't keep up their yard to pay the neighbor who doesn't like the look of the yard, right? You could do something like that to reach that agreement. Okay. So that's the Coase Theorem, right? So, but of course, if they can't come to an agreement, that means that both of them naturally don't have, right? There is no amount that will, there's no socially efficient a negotiation. It's actually more socially efficient for the neighbor to keep their yard dirty, and the other neighbor to just be mad about it, right? Because they're clearly not mad about it enough, right, to pay them money or something, or to do anything about it, essentially, right? So yeah, I think that example is not bad, and I probably didn't do it justice, frankly. So of course, the Coase Theorem is one of those things where it's cool in theory, but we're talking about externalities. Externalities are still a section of this, right? We wouldn't probably talk about it at all if they weren't an issue. So they're still an issue, right? So what do we do to actually deal with this issue, right? Or why is this still an issue? Okay, well, a lot of times, right, if the costs of externality are spread wide, right, it's not just one person, right, it becomes very tough to negotiate, right? It's hard for a whole group of people to negotiate together because they all probably have different interests or different costs on them. And so that makes it difficult to negotiate and have the Coase Theorem work. Okay. And so because of that, then we have to have other systems kind of put into place, right? And so what are those things that we have to do, right? Well, so basically this says that, hey, private people can't come to a solution. So when private people can't come to a solution for this, right, we then see government regulation. I'm not going to shorten that one yet. Government regulation of externalities. Right, the government will step in and do usually one of two things, right? One of the most obvious solutions, right, is taxes, right? Tax the externality, right? And so the example they talked about was the congestion in London, right? So they would tax people who drove in a certain part of London a fee of $16 if they're in that part, and it significantly decreased the amount of traffic in that region, right? I've also had a friend who lived in Colombia who had a thing where you could only drive every other day, right? You had your license or your car, right, can only be in the town every other day, right? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, right? And so if you drove the other day, right, you got a ticket, right? So those things are to help with congestion, to kind of keep because when you have congestion, right, that leads to kind of an economic decrease, causes a lot of issues, right? So taxes are only possible when you can estimate the value of the loss, right, of the externality, right? How much is the externality costing you, right? When you can judge exactly how much that is, you can tax it, right? Because you can tax it at a rate that will be higher than the cost that it is right now, and that'll hopefully counteract that loss, right? But a lot of times that's not really possible, okay? And so what the government can do to step in then is implement a quota, right? Which a quota is a maximum of the amount you can produce of an externality. And the most obvious one of this is the U.S. government kind of creating these carbon tax credits, right? Maximum of the amount you can produce of an externality. Right. So the U.S. government, the Environmental Protection Agency, created these tax credits for the carbon tax credits for the companies that produce sulfur dioxide. Well, they're talking about sulfur dioxide here, but there's this carbon dioxide one where basically they would say, okay, they would break up, the amount of carbon that each company was producing and say, okay, you can only you get a certain amount that you can have each year, right? And then they created these little carbon tax credits that each company had a certain amount of based on how much they polluted. And they can buy and sell those on a carbon tax credit market with other companies, right? So that if they wanted to pollute less, right, they can maybe sell their carbon tax credits, right, to other people or other companies in the market, right? As you can see here, right, they talk about sulfur dioxide, right? The EPA auctions off the right to emit sulfur dioxide to the highest bidders, and then the lower bidders basically were saying it's not worth that value to continue to emit sulfur dioxide, so we're going to lower the amount we have, right? So those are the two ways the government can deal with negative externalities, through taxing it or through creating a quota if you cannot estimate the value of the good, right? Or of the externality, excuse me. If I can, actually, I do want to go back up and maybe more thoroughly explain the Coase Theorem example. Okay. We have, I'm going to use theirs. I think it's fine. We have Sue and we have Tad. Sue and Tad are neighbors. Okay, and Tad has a dirty yard. And Sue hates his dirty yard, right? It reduces her enjoyment. It decreases her enjoyment and the value of her house, right? If you have a neighbor with a dirty yard, a lot of people who are buying houses assume that maybe that neighborhood's not that good, right? Maybe we shouldn't buy in that neighborhood, or we should, lowball them, right? So, if Sue's value of her enjoyment and her value of her house, if that is greater than Ted's value of having a dirty yard, then they can negotiate, right? Right? They can negotiate in that case, right? However, if it does not equal, right? If Tad's value of having a dirty yard, right, is greater than Sue's enjoyment, right, they cannot negotiate, right? Because basically there is no amount that Sue is willing to give to Tad to have him clean up his yard, right? However, there is enough in the other scenario for Sue that she will pay a certain amount of money or do a certain amount of things for Tad that will justify him accepting, right, this idea of having a dirty yard. Okay. So in that particular case, right, there is a negotiation possible, right? But if Ted's value is greater, right, of his dirty yard, then there isn't. Now, however, if there is I don't want to write for that. If there is a local ordinance that forces Tad to comply with having a clean yard, right, basically then we can Sue all of a sudden kind of has a kind of trump card on this, right? And so Tad can negotiate with Sue to find some sort of happy medium, right, where she doesn't report him and he cleans it up, right? So that's kind of the idea of the Coase Theorem, right? In that if there is an ability here to create some sort of socially optimal decision, right? And over here, when I say this is not negotiable, right, that doesn't mean that that's socially unacceptable. It just means that this situation is more more socially acceptable, right, than the other outcome, right? There is no amount of money. If Tad values a dirty yard higher than Sue values her enjoyment and the value of her house, right? If that is greater than this, right, that just means that we're already at the socially optimal level, right? This is the best that is going to get in that scenario. Okay. So hopefully I explained that a little more. I might come back to that again, just because I still don't think I necessarily did it enough justice. But I think honestly, externalities, you can really overthink it, right? Negative externalities, right? You should have less of. Positive externalities, you should have more of. The government can regulate it through taxes and quotas if private people cannot, through the Coase Theorem, through the idea of negotiating, right? And so that about does it for externalities. I'll come back on the next video to talk about property rights. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you